Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has declared so-called three-day ceasefire from May 8 to May 11. This decision was based on humanitarian consideration, according to Kremlin. How do you see the main reasons behind this Putin's so-called three-day ceasefire after previous 30 hours ceasefire?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably three things. Number one, he's trying to change the narrative because he could see that even President Trump was beginning to become more, put more pressure on the Russian side. So I think part of it's trying to change the narrative there. The second thing, of course, is that nobody on the planet believes that Russia would actually live up to any ceasefire. I mean, it's not likely unless they were forced to. And then the third thing, the real reason, I believe, is because they don't want Ukrainian drones landing on Red Square during their Victory Day celebration activities. I think that's the real reason they're hoping for a ceasefire during that period. I thought your prime minister or your foreign minister's response was correct when he said, why not 30 days? Why 3 days? And what are we waiting for? Why not start it right now? And because he knows that this is a Russian information operation.
At the same time, according to Financial Times, Russian dictator Putin told Steve Witkoff that he was ready to halt invasion of Ukraine and the current front lines on the ground. What is your assessment of this possibility of halting the war and negotiations which are in progress right now?
Well, I don't. First of all, I would trust President Zelensky and his team to know what is best for Ukraine and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I think what a ridiculous offer, and the fact that Mr. Witkoff even repeated it is also not very good. That, you know, the big concession from Russia was that they would not take over all of Ukraine. I mean, what kind of a concession is that? So I think the Ukrainian government knows that Ukraine's soldiers are winning on the battlefield, on the ground. They stopped Russia, even without adequate help from the West. Russia cannot defeat Ukraine, and so I think Ukraine is in a position you can make demands about your sovereignty, about future security, but this is up to the Ukrainian government and the people. How much are they willing to continue doing this? But I think it's hard to imagine an outcome with Russia retaining big chunks of Ukraine, and that just be it. That there wouldn't be further actions.
And also, there was an interesting meeting in Vatican between US President Donald Trump and President Zelensky. After this meeting, Donald Trump for the first time questioned Putin's willingness to end the war, threatening another sanctions against Russia. Quote, "It makes me think that maybe Putin doesn't want to stop the war, he is just taping me along and has to deal with differently banking sanctions." Do you have any kind of hope that this meeting in Vatican could change Trump's stance on Putin, Trump's policy on that?
Well, certainly President Zelensky deserves credit for his incredible patience and his persistence, the willingness to sit down and keep trying to explain to this American president what the facts of what's really going on. So, you know, that was a great picture, the two of them sitting there. You know, it was interesting. There were memes of people saying, here's the American president meeting with the leader of the free world, President Zelensky. I mean, it really is an amazing turn of how people perceive these leaders. I would trust whatever President Zelensky said, but I think if this meeting between the two of them was President Trump listening to President Zelensky and finally understanding what was going on, if he then goes and does something and puts real pressure on Russia, then I'll be impressed. But I haven't seen any change yet in the American approach towards Russia. I haven't heard a statement telling Vladimir Putin that if you don't accept this 30 days unconditional ceasefire, unconditional, then I am going to give Ukraine everything that they need without restriction. I am going to add more sanctions, and I am going to take steps that will crush Russia's oil and gas industry. That's real leverage, and the president could do all those things if he was serious. But if he doesn't do any of that, then I will not be very hopeful after this conversation at the Vatican, which is unfortunate. And it's interesting. I think the president, your president, would have taken some encouragement from the fact that every other leader that was there was supporting him, applauded him. And so Europe, it's going to take them a while to get fully organized and to do what they should be doing. There's no doubt that European countries have the capability and the resources and the industry that dwarfs Russia, and that they could really do tangible things that would help make a difference for Ukraine.
Let's cover also this offer from the U.S. administration from Steve Witkoff. Trump's administration proposed to recognize Crimea as a Russian territory de jure and de facto recognize Russian control over occupied territories of Ukraine. If the United States government recognizes Crimea as a Russian territory, what would this mean from a political and military point of view? What kind of strategic leverage Russia would have in case of such recognition?
Well, number one, it would be a catastrophe for American credibility. I mean, because nobody else is going to recognize that. I mean, the EU, European countries have already said, no way, we would not recognize that. So American credibility would be in the trash after something like that. Number two, the Chinese will take note. The Chinese will see that, okay, so the U.S. is flexible on territory as they continue to take parts of the Philippines or Taiwan or other of these disputed islands and coral reefs out in the South China Sea, for example. So this would not be useful in our deterrence efforts against China. And then finally, it would be wrong. I mean, why in the world would the United States go along and say, well, come on, Russia already occupies it and they speak Russian there, and these ridiculous reasons for doing this, which reveals that this administration completely fails to understand what this war is about, the history, the geography, why Ukraine is fighting. So I hope Ukraine does not accept that. Ukraine is not obligated to accept anything that the Russians and the Americans might work out, nor are other European countries. I think for sure Turkey is not going to accept this, and that's important as well. So I hope that Ukraine makes it very clear that you do not recognize this. And then finally, this will have a negative impact on reconstruction, because the big investment companies that would bring enormous amounts of money to help rebuild Ukraine, if they see that Russia occupies Crimea with a so-called American recognition of it, then I think they will be reluctant to invest in reconstruction, because they will see that these are the conditions for Russia resuming the conflict after whatever sort of resolution there is. So I don't see anything good in it.
Also, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance threatens to abandon Ukraine ceasefire talks if there would be any kind of progress. If the U.S. abandoning ceasefire talks, would this be worst case or the best case scenario for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, part of the problem on the U.S. side is that you've got five different people talking about what the plan is. Secretary Rubio, Mr. Witkoff, General Kellogg, Vice President Vance, the president himself, and none of them seem to be in harmony or synchronized in what they're doing. So, whatever the vice president says, it reflects what a part of the administration believes or wants. But I don't know. I'm not confident that he speaks with any authority for the president or the rest of them. It's just it reflects the disorganization and I think the incompetence of their approach. To be honest, unless it looks like the U.S. was getting ready to really provide real support to Ukraine and put real pressure on Russia, then the U.S. walking away from this is not necessarily the worst case, except for us. It would be worst case for us, and it would be really damage any credibility the administration has by doing that. But from Ukraine, the perspective of Ukraine or Europe, I don't know that that's the worst case based on what the administration is doing so far. For the Russians, it would not be good because without the U.S. there, I mean, the Europeans are not confused about who the bad guy is. So that's kind of how I assess it right now.
And do you feel that Europe now is ready to take a lead in this process of supporting Ukraine if U.S. abandons negotiations, if the United States abandons support for Ukraine?
Well, this is where we're going to find out. Can Europe meet the moment? I hear a lot of positive language that comes out of UK and France and Brussels. We will finally have a German government here, I think, in about 2 weeks. And if Mr. Merz is the Bundeskanzler, as we all expect, he's demonstrated clearly that he is on the side of Ukraine. And so that could be a positive change to help get things going. I think, Poland, I'd like to see Poland be more forward-leaning in this, but of course they have a presidential election here in a couple of weeks, and so that's probably why they don't want this to become a presidential issue, perhaps, I don't know. But, Europe has the capability. The only thing that Europe lacks is self-confidence.
Let's cover also the coalition of the willing. The Telegraph reported that the US has privately offered to provide logistical support for this mission and also intelligence to help European troops during their mission in case of a ceasefire deal. Would this be enough for European troops to fully conduct this mission in Ukraine in case of logistical and intelligence support from the United States?
Well, first of all, if this is accurate, why is it a secret? I mean, why would we not say, hell yes, we're going to help? Because this is so important. Yes, we're going to be a part of it. So I don't know how. I'm not confident in that report. I hope it's true, but if it is true, why is it a secret? As to whether it's enough, we need to see what the mission is. We need to hear whoever's going to be in charge of this. What's the chain of command? What is the mission? What are the rules of engagement? The purpose of this would be a force that could deter Russia from violating the ceasefire. I mean, that's what it's about. And so I couldn't say whatever the U.S. is providing, if that's enough, because we don't know the bigger picture. Certainly, obviously, it would help logistics and intelligence. But I think, if that's what it takes for Europe to regain the self-confidence it needs, then obviously I'm all for it.
Let's cover our final topic, another leak from the Signal group chat regarding Pete Haxet. US Defense Secretary Pete Haxet sent sensitive information about strikes in Yemen to another Signal group chat that included his wife and brother and personal attorney. What is your reaction to this? And also we have heard another report that Haxet used for this chat group a public internet connection violating Pentagon security protocols.
Yeah, well, this obviously reveals the lack of competence and professionalism there at the top of the Pentagon. This is embarrassing, and it's going to cause some of our allies to be very reluctant to share intelligence if they know that it could be, in a Signal chat group. And the arrogance of the Secretary of Defense is also very disturbing. And you can be sure that amongst the professionals, the military, as well as the professional civilians who work inside the Department of Defense, it's embarrassing, it's frustrating, it's worrying, and this kind of erodes trust. And, trust is such an important component of any military, and this does nothing to make people confident in their leadership. And for me, one of the most important traits of a good leader was a willingness to accept responsibility, to own it. If there's a problem, say, I screwed up or my team screwed up, we're going to fix it. Instead, all he does is attack the media and deny it when the whole world knows it's true. And that doesn't give me hope that they're going to learn from this.
And don't you think that even many more Pentagon officials are becoming frustrated and don't support Pete Haxet in this office, because it seems like people from the Pentagon, they are leaking this information to media about these Signal chat groups?
Yeah, well, of course, these are his own guys, the ones he brought in. That's the problem. When you talk about wanting to be disruptive and get rid of all the old stuff, that means you get rid of all the old professionals that have been there for a long time and know how to do these things. And so I think, again, he's not the right person for the job. And all the Republican senators who voted to confirm him, knowing that he was not qualified, they deserve the scorn, and they own responsibility for this as well.
Thank you, General Hodges, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Heroam Slava. Thank you, Daniel.
How do you see the possibility the United States government walking away from ceasefire talks? Because recently US Vice President J.D. Vance said that his administration would walk away from ceasefire negotiations unless Ukraine and Russia agree on a ceasefire deal. Do you see this as a good or bad scenario for Ukraine? Because some analysts believe that in such case Europe will lead negotiations with Vladimir Putin, and as a result of that, Putin would be in a more difficult position.
Well, so we need to sort of zero down what that threat really is. And what the threat really is the U.S. will stop supplying arms to Ukraine and stop supplying military intelligence to Ukraine. Do I think that that's likely? I think it's likely. I think there's a reasonable probability, maybe even more likely than not, that the U.S. does that. If that happens, then of course there's all sorts of very negative physical consequences to Ukraine, because the weapons that the U.S. has supplied have been very helpful in the military defense of Ukraine. U.S. supplies 40% of defensive weapons to Ukraine, European Union 60%. And if the U.S. drops out, that means the Europeans have to pick up the slack. Will the Europeans pick up the slack? Maybe. I don't know for sure. I think that there's a possibility that the Europeans at that point will decide that instead of digging into their own pockets, they should confiscate the frozen $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. If that happened, then from a resource money perspective, Ukraine would probably be in the same position they were before the U.S. pulled out. But it doesn't solve the problem that the U.S. supplies certain types of weapons that are unavailable anywhere else, like the Patriot missile defense system, which shoots down incoming missiles from Russia. There's no way to replace the intelligence that comes from U.S. spy satellites that are constantly hovering above the territory and such things like that. And so I think that if U.S. were to withdraw from military aid for Ukraine, Ukraine would still be able to survive. But I think that there would be a lot more damage, a lot more death, and it would be far preferable if the U.S. stayed as an ally and stayed as a supporter of Ukraine.
Let's cover also a situation inside Russia and Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Recently, Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik, who was a senior military officer in the Russia's general staff, has been killed in car bomb attack. Kremlin blames Ukraine for this attack. How can you assess the psychological consequences of this attack, and what does it mean for Vladimir Putin, and what does it mean? What does such attack mean in the middle of negotiations?
Well, Russia has been launching every night attacks on Ukrainian civilians, killing women, children, men, destroying property of innocent Ukrainian civilians. And so if a military person who was involved in killing those civilians is all of a sudden killed, it seems that all is fair in war. And it's certainly not something that anybody can get upset about. It's also important to point out that if Ukraine really was involved in this, and I don't have any information one way or another, but it should, if Ukraine was, then it should put the fear into the hearts of other generals and other officials in Russia that they could potentially be killed as well if they're involved in terrible atrocities in Ukraine. And so it's not just a one-sided thing. It can't be that Ukraine suffers casualties of civilians and that everyone in Russia can sit there feeling safe and immune from consequences.
From your perspective, do you believe that there are at least some people around Putin who are trying to persuade him to agree with ceasefire proposal, to have ceasefire deal?
I don't think there's anybody in Russia that is trying to contain Putin. I think Putin is got his own mind, he makes his own decisions, and that anybody who has any different opinion than him doesn't express it out of fear. Everybody is terrified of Vladimir Putin. And so the only person who can put pressure on Putin, if he wanted to, is the President of the United States, Donald Trump. So far, other than a few words, I haven't seen any evidence that he's ready to put pressure on Putin to end the war.
You just mentioned about Trump. US President Trump has been threatening to impose tariffs and sanctions on Russian goods, secondary tariffs. How can you assess the effectiveness of such a decision if it is being imposed by US administration? I mean, sanctions, tariffs, and also additional secondary tariffs on Russian oil and gas on those countries who are buying Russian oil and gas.
The United States, if they wanted to, could completely decapitate Russia economically. The United States has the capacity to ruin Russia. And so if that decision was taken, and it was taken in a way, in a smart way, things could go very badly for Putin. And what I mean by that is that the one remaining unsanctioned part of the economy is oil. Russia continues to export oil. If the United States of America decided to tell countries that if they buy Russian oil, then they will be sanctioned, they won't buy Russian oil. If Russia can't sell its oil, then Putin will not have money to fund his war, and he'll be then forced into a proper negotiating situation where he has to give stuff up. But at the moment, Trump has not done that.
However, such big countries like China, India, and other big actors in this game, they're buying Russian oil and gas. Do you believe that the US government has enough leverage to force these countries to stop, to hold buying Russian oil and gas by imposing these sanctions? Would it be enough to prevent them from buying Russian oil and gas?
Absolutely, it would. If the United States said to an Indian oil refinery that if you buy Russian oil, then we will impose sanctions on you, so that and we will impose sanctions on anyone who does business with you, I guarantee you, the next minute, the Indian oil refinery will stop buying Russian oil. It's a certainty.
So they would not have any other choice but to stop buying Russian oil and gas due to sanctions.
That's correct.
And also, recently, US President Donald Trump said that he has been putting pressure also on Russia. However, there is a big discussion in the Trump administration about doing business with Russia after ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your personal message to American businessmen who are considering right now the possibility of doing business with Russia and in Russia?
Well, I don't think that there's seriously many people considering doing business in Russia. Even before this war started, it was a toxic business environment full of unbelievable corruption, violence, expropriation, and other nastiness. And I know all about that because I'm the poster child of what goes wrong if you're an investor in Russia. I was the largest foreign investor in Russia. I was expelled from the country. My offices were raided. They seized our documents, and then the documents were used to steal our companies and steal $230 million of taxes that we paid to the Russian government. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, exposed the crime, and he was subsequently arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed in Russian police custody. And so what I tell anybody who's considering investing in Russia is that you don't just risk losing your money, you also risk losing your life.
And also, there is a big public discussion and also inner discussion in the White House about lifting sanctions against Russian economy. On the other hand, European allies propose to lift sanctions against Russia only in case of full ceasefire deal and only at different stages, not just lifting all sanctions in one moment, but creating several stages during which sanctions should be lifted. And also, big question remains what should be and what would be with Russian frozen money in Europe. Do you believe that European countries would be happy to also, for example, allow Russia to buy Boeing planes using Russia's frozen assets, even if Donald Trump negotiates and if he reaches such deal with Vladimir Putin?
No, it's totally unacceptable. Russia has done $500 billion of damage to Ukraine. Russia needs to pay for it. And so it's obvious that the frozen Russian assets should be used either for the defense of Ukraine, if this war carries on, or for the reconstruction of Ukraine, if the war ends. But under no circumstances should that money be used to buy Boeing airplanes. And on top of that, there's a whole bunch of Boeing airplanes that the Russians confiscated from a bunch of Western leasing companies. And so before anyone even talks about buying more Russian Boeing planes, Russia should be returning those planes that they stole.
Let's also cover Donald Trump's tariffs and its influence on the global economy. How do you see the influence of this global trade war between the US and China? And do you believe that this decision was right to impose tariffs, then to change, to recalculate the main effectiveness and the main consequences of this decision? It seems like Donald Trump has changed his mind and made some exemptions from, for example, electronic goods from China shipping to US. What is your your take on the current stage of global trade war between the US and China?
Well, I think it's a total disaster for the U.S. economy, for the U.S. consumer, and also for the Chinese and for others as well. I mean, this is probably the single largest self-inflicted economic wound that anyone could ever have thought of. It's terrible. But there is one silver lining, which is that it's pushed the price of oil down. And as Russia's main commodity export is oil, these tariffs and all this consequence of these tariffs at least put Putin in a more tenuous position.
You just mentioned about the Russian oil. What kind of price for Russian oil would really decapitate Putin's economy, will destroy his regime?
I think if you have the price of oil in the low 40s, that's it. Putin's finished. 50s is hard. Where it is right now, it's not good. He really needs a lot higher oil prices to survive.
But don't you think that Russia has also another currency reserves inside Russia?
Russia is a very rich country because of all the money that's been accumulated over a period of time. And so Russia's not a heavily indebted country. There's not a lot of interest payments to make. And so we've seen lots of much worse countries economically survive for a very long time. And so I wouldn't in any way predict that Russia stops functioning, but I can say that Russia can't borrow money from the West at the moment. And Russia, if there's no oil money coming in, it's going to become a lot tighter, and they're going to have to make a lot of compromises that they didn't have to make before. And those compromises would be helpful to Ukraine.
And do you believe that current economic situation in Russia try to also convince Vladimir Putin to at least stay in this game of negotiations, forces Putin to negotiate with Trump, to stay in this game, even if he doesn't want to stop the war?
I don't think anyone's forcing Putin to do anything. Putin makes his own decisions. He doesn't care about the effect it has on the economy. He doesn't care about the number of dead Russian soldiers. All he cares about is Vladimir Putin. He cares that he stays in power, which keeps him alive. That's his main objective. And I think that, all this stuff is not helpful to him, but at the end of the day, he's not going to go starving.
Thank you, Mr. Browder, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, and glory to Ukraine.